was in many ways inferior to those of their enemies. Tanks such as the Char B1, Matildas, KVs, and many others proved difficult for the weak armaments of the early panzers and often could do little against such vehicles without the support of weapons like the 88 flak gun. This would lead not just to the development of heavier tanks with larger guns, such as the Ferdinand and Jagdtiger, but also to less ridiculous designs. Among these would be a variety of open-top tank destroyers ranging from one based on the Panzer I all the way to the 12.8cm armed Sturr Emil. Today, though, we will be focusing on one which is often overlooked compared to its more eye-catching cousins. The Nashorn would be conceived as part of an effort started by Hitler in 1942 to create an 8.8cm anti-tank gun matching the performance of the 8.8cm Flak 41, which would become known as the Pak 43. While smaller anti-tank guns could be moved with relative ease, the larger guns, such as the 8.8cm, were impossible to move without heavy equipment. For this reason, it was decided that creating a vehicle which could carry this gun would be quite useful. While originally this was to be mounted on an entirely new chassis, it was soon realized that this would not be ready for production by early 1943, and the decision was made to instead create a more expedient version which would use parts from the Panzer III and IV. The contract for this design would be given to Alket, who would return with a completed design by the beginning of October 1942. Just at a glance, it was already clear that the vehicle was built using existing parts, with the chassis being very similar to the Panzer IV it was based on. These were not interchangeable though, with the hull of the Hornisse, as it was then known, being wider than the Panzer IV at the same width as the Panzer III. This led to the drivetrain being made up of a mixture of components from both vehicles. As for the suspension, this matched the hull, with it also from the Panzer IV. However, despite the similarities on its lower half, the Hornisse was completely different above that. The front of the vehicle featured a sloped plate replacing the more stepped design of the original, only being broken up by a protruding position for the driver. Behind that sat a large, thinly armored fighting compartment to house the rest of the crew, as well as the main gun and its ammunition. As the eagle-eyed among you may have guessed, the engine was moved from the rear towards the middle of the vehicle, which was fed air through openings on the sides of the hull. This helped to better balance the vehicle, as well as create a clearer fighting compartment for the crew. Speaking of the crew, this would consist of 5 men, with a commander, gunner, and loader in the rear, as well as a driver and radio operator in the hull. In order to feed the massive 8.8cm Pak 43/1 L71, it would carry 40 rounds of various types, as well as around 1,000 rounds of smaller caliber ammunition for the crew's different small arms. As for the main gun, it was able to traverse 15 degrees to either side, with a maximum elevation of 20 degrees and 5 degrees of depression. While the firepower was certainly impressive, the armor was a bit less so, being only 30 mm at its thickest on the hull front, with the majority of the vehicle protected only by a thin 10 mm superstructure. The benefit of this thin armor was far less weight than more heavily armored tank destroyers, but it still ended up being significantly heavier than the original Panzer IV, only being surpassed by later up-armored models. With the same HL-120 Maybach engine of the Panzer IV, providing it with 265 horsepower, it was capable of an average road speed of around 25 km per hour and a maximum speed of 40 km per hour. Before we go further, I should mention that this was not the only vehicle to be built using this new chassis, with another, known as the Hummel, meaning bumblebee, also being built. That vehicle, rather than being a tank destroyer, was created as a self-propelled artillery and armed with a 15cm howitzer. A total of 705 of them were built by the end of the war, with the later production vehicles featuring a redesigned frontal hull to give the driver and radio operator more space. Additionally, 157 ammunition carrier variants were built with a modified version of the same chassis to supply units fielding Hummels with a steady supply of ammo. One additional change to the Hummel was the inclusion of an additional crew member, bringing the count up to 6, with 4 of those manning the gun. Units controlling these SPGs would see combat on all fronts, with even a few examples of captured Hummels being pressed back into service on the Eastern Front. An additional odd variant of the Hummel appeared late in the war, consisting of a Hummel chassis fitted with a 10.5cm gun from the Vesp, another type of SPG. Reports indicate 10 of these were accepted in 44 to 45, with a single photo remaining of one. Presumably, these SPGs being used for more indirect fire roles meant they suffered less from the problems caused by the thin armor compared to their tank destroyer relatives. Back to the Hornisse, production would kick off in early 1943 with a total of 494 being built, with the last being completed in March of 1945. By now you may be wondering why I have thus far been referring to this vehicle as Hornisse, which translates to Hornet. The reason for this is the same as we discussed in the previous episode on the Ferdinand. Despite the fact that having two similar vehicles being named Hornet and Bumblebee is a pretty solid naming scheme if you ask me, a certain man by the name of Hitler seemingly did not agree, and in November of 1943, the name was officially changed to Nashorn, meaning rhino. This was the same time when the Ferdinand, named after Ferdinand Porsche, had its name changed to the Elephant. So don't be confused if you see the Nashorn referred to by its former name, they are the same vehicle. Despite being essentially the opposite end of the tank destroyer spectrum compared to the heavily armored Ferdinand, the Nashorn would see a similarly mixed performance in combat. Strangely, even though it weighed less than half what the Ferdinand did, both vehicles suffered similar problems, with a major one being overheating. This is not too surprising for the Nashorn, given the mounting of the engine placed it in a mostly enclosed area, and if you know anything about engines, you know they don't tend to like that. The weight of the vehicle also played a part in this. Another problem was found with the sighting system, which during travel would move, causing a significant shift in the accuracy due to the gun and sight no longer being aligned. That issue was later remedied, however, as with any tank, small problems always occur, which often kept these rhinos out of combat. Above all other things though, the thin armor of the Nashorn can be seen as its biggest flaw. This armor was hardly even strong enough to stop small arms fire, let alone dedicated anti-tank guns, and combined with the lack of a roof, made them easy prey for aircraft. This was compounded by units in the field repeatedly misusing their Nashorns, which led to losses which otherwise could have been avoided. We know this must have been significant, as it led to the creation of what is essentially a "how to not get yourself killed" guide for the crews. This instructed them to use the Nashorn in the role which suited it best, knocking out targets from a distance. These instructions can be found in Panzertrack 7.3 and read as follows. The Schwere Panzerjäger Abteilung Hornisse is the mobile defense for the command to concentrate against strong enemy tank attacks. Employ as an Abteilung or company, distributing under company strength reduces operational readiness because then controlled by radio, resupplying ammunition and maintenance are not possible. 2. The Hornisse is an 8.8 cm Pack-auf-Selbstfahrerfette. Its strengths are long-range rapid fire with accurate sights that can engage all types of tanks at range up to 4 kilometers and mobility as a self-propelled gun. Its weakness are the high superstructure and light armor. 3. The Hornissen await the enemy tank attack in ambush and firing positions. Thorough scouting is needed. 4. Schwere Panzerjäger Hornissen are not Sturmgeschütz or Panzer and are not to be employed like them. 5. Listen to the commander of the Hornissen before giving orders. The value of these vehicles lie in the range of the gun. Their effective range is from 1,000 to 3,000 meters. While the lack of armor did hold them back, similarly to how too much armor held the Ferdinands back, when used correctly using concealment and range, the Nashorn was incredibly lethal. One example showed 12 KVs and 4 T-34s taken out of action at the cost of just a single Nashorn. Another tells of a single Nashorn commanded by Lieutenant Albert Ernst destroying 8 T-34s in a single day and another 14 with only 21 rounds of ammunition just a few weeks later. Out of all these examples though, the funniest is probably the IS-2 knocked out by a Nashorn from the Panzerjäger Abteilung 88, who quickly knocked out the tank after spotting it on the move. Unfortunately for them, this particular IS-2 had already been captured and it was being towed back behind friendly lines. I guess you could call that a real-world case of kill stealing. As for non-Soviet armor, a Nashorn was credited with the destruction of one of the few Pershings to be knocked out during World War II and the only one to be written off. Remarkably, the shell penetrated the Pershing, passing between the driver's legs, setting the tank on fire, but the crew were able to escape and survive even if the tank was lost to the flames. Reportedly, the Pershing was still repairable. Those repairs would have required several months of work, though, leading to it being used instead for parts. These tank destroyers would see use across the different fronts against all manner of Allied armor, none of which were capable of withstanding its firepower, but similarly, the Nashorn could not withstand their return fire, being a true glass cannon. Following the end of the war, the story gets a little fuzzy, with some sources claiming 12 Nashorn ended up in the hands of the Czechoslovakian army. However, other sources indicate they received the same number of Hummels, leading me to believe this may be a case of mistaken identity given how similar the two look. If you happen to have any additional information on this, please feel free to share it with me, as I have been unable to completely verify that theory. As for the Hummel, several ended up in Syria thanks to France, and one briefly saw use by Romania in a parade, which we can see faintly in the background of this photo. When I was first starting this script, I was honestly unsure of which series the Nashorn would fit best into, initially thinking it might be a Forged for Battle candidate, but I think we can all see it is truly deserving of the Cursed by Design label. Between the Nashorn and the Ferdinand, we are provided with real-world examples of the problems of both too little armor as well as too much armor. While this is far from a set-in-stone rule, given the performance of vehicles such as the thin-skinned M18 Hellcat, we certainly see why vehicles with both reasonable firepower as well as decent protection are often preferred. Today, only 3 examples of the Nashorn remain, with one in Kubinka in Russia, one in the US as part of the US Army Armor and Cavalry Collection, and a final example owned privately in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, it was the victim of a garage fire which caused some damage, but that has since been repaired and it is currently the only operation example in the world. As for the Hummel, there are 6 surviving examples in various museums, with an extraordinary example at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum, which was basically pieced back together like a jigsaw puzzle. So what do you think of this thin-skinned rhino and its stinging stepbrother? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to try out World of Tanks using that link and the code COMBAT to get that starter bonus if you are a new player. Thank you all so much for watching, and just a quick reminder that the Kone Fumo will still be available for a few days after this video's release, so make sure to grab one if you haven't already. Thanks as always to my channel members for their support of this content, and if you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more, and check out my video on the Ferdinand if you haven't done so already. Hope to see you there. When you think of German projects from the mid to late war, your mind likely jumps to designs like the massive Jagdtiger or infamous Maus. These heavy vehicles with their powerful armaments are now iconic. However, they also have a tendency to steal the spotlight from other designs. Even towards the end of the war, it was the smaller vehicles built on older chassis which formed much of the backbone of the German army. Whether it be through their use as SPAA, recon vehicles, artillery, or, in today's case, tank destroyers, these tanks could be argued to have been more important to the war effort than their larger brethren. Join me as we explore the story of one of these tank destroyers built using the humble Panzer 38T chassis you likely know as the Hetzer.
I'm a man. I'm a Canadian.
vehicles built on the chassis of the T-34 or the IS. These certainly played an important role in the defense of the USSR as well as the advance back east into the German homeland. However, despite these achievements, these more well-known vehicles have stolen the spotlight away from some of the true heroes of the early defense of the motherland. Today, we will embark on the first of several videos documenting these early self-propelled guns which helped slow the rapid advance of the Nazi forces. Our journey begins with a vehicle you may be familiar with, commonly known as the ZIS-30. Often, the subjects of my videos are vehicles which are known only to a small portion of the tank enthusiast community. This can make it difficult to find examples of how they may have performed when they saw combat, as no one has bothered to find footage of them or it has been lost to history. That would be the case for today's topic as well if it weren't for games like War Thunder, who is the sponsor of this video. If you've somehow watched my videos and still don't know what War Thunder is, it's a free-to-play vehicle combat game featuring over 2,000 tanks, planes, naval vessels, and helicopters, including the ZIS-30. Unlike many other games, War Thunder's vehicles don't have health bars and instead have individual components modeled which you must destroy in order to knock out your enemies. War Thunder is available for free on PC, PS5, Xbox Series X and S, as well as the previous console generation. Try out the game for yourself using my link in the description and get a special bonus to help you on your way to the ZIS-30 or whatever vehicle you choose, including free premium vehicles, premium account time, boosters, and more. Thanks to them for sponsoring. Now let's get into today's main topic. The Soviet Union had experimented with the concept of the tank destroyer and self-propelled guns for well over a decade. It could even be argued that there were several designs prior to the Communist Revolution which may have been considered tank destroyers. However, most of these were little more than concepts or prototypes which never saw combat. For this reason, I have chosen the ZIS-30 as the place to start this series of Cursed by Design episodes on the evolution of the Soviet tank destroyers. Before we look at the vehicle itself, though, let's consider the situation in which it was created. Following the conquest of most of Western Europe by the Third Reich, Hitler set his eyes eastward on the communist-controlled territories of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. War would finally break on the 22nd of June 1941 as Operation Barbarossa began and the Nazi war machine began to move rapidly across the border. Among these forces were around 3,000 German panzers, with many crewed by veteran tankers from previous conquests. This was indeed a tremendous force, backed by both the Luftwaffe and around 3 million men, without counting non-German manpower. Regardless of this, if one were to solely look at the paper statistics of both armies, they likely would come to the conclusion that the Soviets would send the Germans packing in short order. Looking at the number of tanks alone, they had nearly double the vehicles ready for battle on the day of the invasion, with estimates putting their total armored vehicles in stockpile at nearly 30,000, with 24,000 of those being tanks. In reality, though, the majority of those were inoperable, with only around 7,000 being able to fight for even a short time without significant work. This was still double the number of German vehicles, and contrary to what some may lead you to believe, the Soviet armor in many cases was superior to their German counterparts. This can be seen when the Wehrmacht encountered vehicles like the KVs, with their thick armor being extremely resistant to the 50mm cannons of the German panzers. This advantage did not result in the Soviets stopping the invaders, but it did hinder their advance significantly. It would not be without heavy losses, though, and the Red Army would hemorrhage thousands of tanks, with around 5,000 being destroyed or captured by August of 1941. Clearly, the invasion was an utter disaster for the Red Army, as the Third Reich crawled further and further across their territory, thanks in no small part to their armored forces. What the Soviet Union needed was a cheap vehicle which could be produced quickly. This would in the long term end up being the venerable T-34, but in the early days of the invasion, these were not yet available in large numbers. This is where the ZIS-30 enters the story. The program that would eventually lead to the ZIS-30 actually began in the spring of 1941 before Operation Barbarossa, when the idea of tank destroyers built on artillery tractors was proposed. Several of the vehicles put forward as potential candidates included the STZ-5 and Voroshilовец heavy artillery tractor, with the former mounting a 57mm and the latter carrying an 85mm armament. Most of these ideas would be discarded in early June due to a variety of issues with the vehicles which made them unsuitable for the job. We will see in the next episode in this series that there was another design known as the HTZ-16 which saw production simultaneously with the ZIS-30, but it deserves a video of its own. All of this planning went out the window just a few weeks later when the aforementioned German forces made their unwelcome entry into Soviet land. With tank production now absolutely critical to the war effort, the production of artillery tractors was cut heavily to avoid using up precious resources which could instead be made into tanks. One of these unassuming vehicles to encounter the chopping block was that of the small tractor known as the T-20. On July 1, 1941, the previously shelved idea of using tractors and trucks for tank destroyers was restarted in earnest. Now, the two candidates for this were the T-20 and the Gaz AAA truck. It should be obvious by now which option they went with, considering the ZIS-30 was not built on a truck. However, this was not the end for truck-based tank destroyers, as we will consider in a future video in this series. Back to the T-20, it was found that conversion of this vehicle to a tank destroyer was not only simpler, but would result in better off-road performance than its wheeled counterpart. The first prototype of the ZIS-30 was available on July 20th, 1941, only about a week longer than the 2-week time frame given to the actual designing of the tank destroyer. This speaks to how simple the conversion was, with it requiring minimal changes from the original tractor. Carrying the 57mm ZIS-2 anti-tank gun, this vehicle certainly had the firepower to deal with its German foes. When firing high-velocity armor-piercing, this cannon could defeat 140mm of armor at 500 meters compared to the 94mm of the F-34 76.2mm, which the T-34 and many other vehicles were equipped with. This made it perfect for a tank-killing gun, as the high-explosive shell performance was terrible compared to the armor-defeating ability. It was also noted that if necessary, the new ZIS-3 76mm cannon could be fitted to the tractor. The design was clearly looked upon favorably, with an initial request for 3,000 of the tank destroyers in only 5 months. Considering production of the tractors they were being built on had been largely eliminated, this was wishful thinking. Before a decision was made, though, field trials would need to be conducted with the new prototype. This would result in several improvements to the ZIS-30, so let's now take a peek at what the final production vehicle looked like. The T-20 tractor, or as it is sometimes called, the Komsomolets, was a tracked light artillery tractor consisting of a thinly armored hull with around 7 to 10mm of armor, powered by a 4-cylinder Gaz engine, the same as found in several Soviet cars and trucks, and was essentially a copy of a Ford engine. From this base vehicle, the seats in the rear were removed, being replaced by the ZIS-2 gun mount. Along with the gun, it received the attached gun shield, which, similar to the hull armor, was only around 7mm thick. This was not enough to stop much, but would still provide the crew a reasonable amount of protection. The remaining space was used for ammunition storage and the crew who would man the gun. The driver and hull gunner remained in their original location. Following the field trials, folding legs were added to the back, which would help manage the recoil from the gun. Folding sides were also added to allow the crew some additional foot space. Despite the early expectations for mass conversion of the T-20, the actual numbers produced from September to October was only around 100 vehicles. Part of this issue is similar to what happened with the 57mm armed T-34 project, where lack of cannon production added to the other issues, reducing production. These ZIS-30s were reportedly given a tricolor camo and immediately were sent into combat. Combat performance of the ZIS-30 appears to have been good, with the small size allowing it to easily be concealed, allowing for engagements with less chance of being spotted and receiving return fire. One report claims a single ZIS-30 was able to knock out 3 German vehicles at a range of 2 kilometers, causing the rest to abandon their advance and retreat. As I have said in the past, it can be hard to trust first-hand accounts without the matching reports from the opposing side, but against the German vehicles of that period, this was well within the capabilities of the tank destroyer. Exact reporting of where ZIS-30s were assigned and fought is difficult to find, as they were often referred to by other names, including just being called anti-tank guns. Despite their hasty construction, some of these vehicles reportedly survived in combat for several years, with ZIS-30s possibly still around in 1944 and one even surviving the war, and now on display at the Museum of Military Equipment, Battle Glory of the Urals. There are also a handful of original T-20 tractors in collections in both Russia and Finland. This reported success does not mean the vehicle was without flaws though, with one major one being the engine. The small 4-cylinder engine struggled in more adverse conditions, not a surprise given it only had around 50 horsepower. One unit even submitted feedback on the vehicle to the GAU Artillery Committee, reporting that in combat the gun was fired without folding down the coulters due to, quote, no time to deploy, which resulted in cases of them flipping over. I find it hard to blame the vehicle itself for that, as despite the short length causing instability, not deploying the thing specifically designed to prevent that is really just user error. All things considered though, the performance of the small tank destroyer is remarkable given how kludged it was, to borrow a term from Forgotten Weapons. The ZIS-30 was far from the only vehicle of its type, as we will see in future videos, but it did not really have a long impact on Soviet tank destroyer design. The design lives on today within a variety of model kits and video games, including War Thunder, as I mentioned at the start of the video. I want to know what you think of this little tractor which carried such a large cannon, so leave your thoughts in the comments. While you're down there, don't forget to try out War Thunder using my link to get that free bonus, and maybe you'll run into me playing my ZIS-30. Thanks as always to all of you for watching, and especially to those of you who have joined as YouTube members. I want to give a special shout out to these members who have been supporting my channel for over a year, which is incredible and much appreciated. That's all I have for you today though, so be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video on another early Soviet tank destroyer, that being the HTZ-16. Hope to see you there.
In 1922, the Soviet Union was formed, a new nation that would have a profound impact on the entire globe. It would emerge from the remnants of the Russian Empire after a long and bloody civil war.
Russia, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, was a country in absolute turmoil. A brutal and bloody clash of arms trying to wipe out this new regime before it can take control of the country.
The Bolsheviks finally succeeded in about 1922, and then came the hard work of trying to create, for the first time ever, a new socialist country.
From out of nowhere, Vladimir
Vehicles built on When one thinks of German tanks of the Second World War, the mind might immediately envision vehicles such as the infamous Tiger, or maybe even the Panther or Panzer IV. However, as many of you may already know, there were many more tanks developed and produced by the Germans during the war. Today, we will be taking a look at one of the older production model tanks of the German Army in the form of the Panzer I. Throughout history, there have been countless tanks, all designed to kill. But not all have been a success. What happened to the ones that never made it? And why did they fail? My name is Konavar. Join me as we journey through time, uncovering failed projects and forgotten creations in Cursed by Design. A quick thanks to the YouTube channel Decode for sponsoring the video. Decode is a new YouTube channel that uploads short documentaries exploring the greatest mysteries from past and present, similar to this channel. Their recent upload is about the secret ghost army of World War II, Operation Fortitude. This D-Day deception campaign was meant to fool the Nazis by using fake military buildings, inflatable tanks, and dummy airplanes. The main objective was to spread German forces as widely as possible and to draw their gaze away from Normandy, giving the Allied invasion the greatest possible chance of success. Check out their latest video by clicking the link in the description or in the pinned comment down below, and be sure to let them know Cone sent you. The Panzer I was the product of years of projects undertaken by the Reichswehr, the military of the interwar Weimar Republic and predecessor to the Wehrmacht. Ever since the conclusion of the First World War and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had been forbidden from producing or developing armored vehicles. This led to an assortment of secret projects throughout the late 20s and early 30s. Some of these projects included the well-known Leichtraktor and others such as the Großtraktor, all designed in secrecy to avoid repercussions from the treaty. These tanks were not very advanced, but were relatively impressive designs for a nation that had been forbidden from development for nearly 10 years. From 1928 to the early 1930s, these tanks provided necessary training for commanders and soldiers that would eventually make up the German Panzer Corps. The clandestine nature around German tank development came to an end as the German government swiftly changed from the Weimar Republic to Hitler's Nazi Germany. With the change in government, the policy on Germany's military also changed in the direction of rearmament. One of the areas of importance to rearmament was Germany's lack of armored vehicles, and by the request of individuals such as Heinz Guderian, Hitler approved the development of both armored divisions and the tanks that would equip them. The first of these tanks would be the Panzer I, which was originally designated the Krupptraktor. The Panzer I was a modern tank of its time, being a light and nimble tank with relatively good armor, 7 to 13 millimeters, and a normal armament of 2 machine guns in a traversable turret. These tanks were operated by a crew of 2, with a driver in the hull and commander in the turret who would also operate the 2 machine guns. While the Panzer I was fairly capable of fighting in the battlefields of, say, 1933, its service life saw it quickly becoming obsolete even before the Second World War. It would only be produced until 1938, and by this time it had been outperformed by the Panzer II and eventually the III and IV. Nevertheless, the Panzer I had been involved in the Spanish Civil War and the invasions of Poland and France, where it showed both its capabilities and its weaknesses. One of these weaknesses was the armor, which was dangerously thin for the operations of the Wehrmacht in the war. A light tank with a maximum of 13 millimeters of armor and only 2 crew members was no longer suitable, which led to the Panzer I's being given different roles and also being upgunned and modified into tank destroyers. However, one unique modification of the Panzer I was the Ausführung F, which radically changed the entire design of the tank. As previously stated, one of the major weaknesses of the Panzer I was its thin armor that was easily penetrated by modern weapons of many nations of Europe in the 1940s. For comparison, the Panzer IIIe produced in 1939 and 1940 had 30 millimeters of armor around the entire tank. This led to more armor being desired, as the German doctrine at the time expected to encounter multiple enemy strongholds and fortresses, and thus required the usage of breakthrough tanks that would have enough armor to take a beating and still provide support for infantry and other tanks. In 1939, a contract was given to Krauss-Maffei, the same company that would later develop Germany's current main battle tank, the Leopard 2. The contract was for the development of a small breakthrough tank based on the Panzer I. Requirements for the vehicle were for it to have frontal armor of 80 millimeters and a weight of 19 tons at most, so that it would be able to cross bridges. The frontal armor value of 80 millimeters made this small tank equal to that of the early KV-1 heavy tanks, and certainly more armored than any German tank produced until the Tiger I. The tank was to be armed similarly to the Panzer I, with the turret housing 2 MG-34 machine guns side by side. It was given the designation VK-1801, the standard designation for prototype tanks at the time, the VK standing for Volketten or fully tracked. By the end of its production, the Panzer I-F would have 30 units completed. The production tanks, designated as the Panzerkampfwagen I NA Verstärkt or reinforced, had many unique attributes, such as incorporating the interleaved road wheels also found on the Tiger I. The usage of this suspension helped to give the tank a better ground pressure and off-road capability, as well as saving on the usage of rubber. The layout and design of its armor was also very similar to the Tiger I, and while it retained many hatches from the original Panzer I design, they were scaled down significantly. Another interesting addition was the inclusion of 5 periscopes for the tank's commander, which gave a nearly 360-degree view of the outside. The tank was also equipped with an FUG-2 radio for communications and a Maybach HL45P 6-cylinder diesel engine that produced 150 horsepower and gave the tank a maximum speed of 25 km an hour. In 1942, the Panzer I-F and the very similar Panzer II-J were assigned to the 66th Special Purpose Battalion for the planned invasion of Malta under Operation Hercules. As this operation never happened, the tanks would instead be sent to the Eastern Front to support the invasion of the Soviet Union. Their first taste of action happened on September 10th, where 2 became stuck in the mud, and by September 25th, 2 more tanks had been taken out of action due to repairs or the terrible conditions. One benefit that was discovered was that the tanks were very resistant to mines, which led to them being used as minesweepers in many occasions. In November, Panzer Is on the southern front of the war were deployed to Kiev, and by the end of the month, only 1 out of the 8 tanks sent to the 1st Panzer Division was still operational. Eventually, the tanks would be reserved for anti-partisan operations in Belarus and the Balkans, where they were successful in their tasks. Because of their nature as compact heavy tanks, these vehicles were able to effectively combat resistance forces without suffering any reported casualties. Of course, once Soviet forces pushed further into German territory near the end of the war, these tanks were once again forced to face vehicles in which they had no hope of competing against with their 2 machine guns. By the end of the war, 3 tanks were captured by the Soviets, 2 still exist, with one being displayed at the Kubinka Tank Museum and the other one in Belgrade, Serbia. While the Panzer I-F was designed as a formidable tank to take on enemy fortifications with its heavy armor, these baby Tigers significantly failed at their designed purpose in their first deployments on the Eastern Front. Nearly all of the vehicles were either lost due to poor environmental conditions or technical problems. Those who did encounter enemy forces were unable to effectively combat them. However, these tanks did find immense success in purposes that they were not designed for, anti-partisan and minesweeping usage. Their heavy armor and compact size made them perfect for combating resistance forces, as they could be deployed easily in towns and provided more support than an armored car. Despite this limited success, the Panzer I-F can be said to be a tank that had appeared to be a mighty machine on paper, but ended up being cursed as a tank that was fighting in the wrong war. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss my video that will be released this Friday. With the help of the American Heritage Museum, I was able to record an exclusive interview about their current restoration of a Panzer I, which will be on display very soon. We talked about not just the Panzer I, but you can also hear a bit more about some of the tanks in their collection like the Horo and IS-2, so be sure to check that out. Thanks once again to Decode for sponsoring this video, and be sure to check them out down below. See you in the next one. In previous episodes, we've ventured to the Far East to discuss tanks from Japan, a region often overlooked in comparison to their European counterparts. Something that many people forget, though, is that the Axis did not just consist of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Although they made up a smaller percentage of the forces and an even smaller percentage of the tanks fielded during the war, countries like Romania and Hungary were still heavily involved in the conflict. With that being said, it's really no surprise the tanks of these nations are so easily overlooked due to the fairly insignificant number they fielded. In future videos, I plan to look into many of these vehicles, such as the Turan and Marechal, but for today, we're going to consider one of the Romanian attempts to upgrade some of their vastly outdated tanks they had received earlier in the war. Throughout history, there have been countless tanks, all designed to kill. But not all have been a success. What happened to the ones that never made it? And why did they fail? My name is Konevar. Join me as we journey. When one thinks of German tanks,
Next one. What's it gonna be?
Before we get into the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to Arms Trade Tycoon Tanks, who helped by supplying the 3D model that you will be seeing in this video. If you want to support that project, please check them out using the link to their Kickstarter in the description below. When thinking of the largest tanks ever built, it's no surprise that most people instantly think of vehicles from the Second World War, with massive designs being built both prior to the conflict, such as the Char II-C and T-35, to ones produced during the war like the TOG-2 and legendary Maus. However, this causes many to overlook the earlier designs originating from the First World War. In fact, several of the designs from that period are so enormous that they would dwarf all the tanks I just mentioned. Arguably, the largest of these is a machine known as the K-Wagen, which was the first super heavy tank in history, unsurprisingly built by the Germans. We covered that tank in a recent video, so be sure to check that out after this one if you are interested in that story. For today's video, we'll be looking at another which was being worked on across the Atlantic, which would not only be one of the largest tanks ever built, but also the first heavy tank ever in the US military. Speaking of tanks from World War II, today's sponsor Call of War lets you take control of not just tanks, but infantry and aircraft. Call of War is a free online strategy game which lets you face off against up to 100 players in real-time battles as you fight for control of the map. Once you pick one of the real-world nations from the conflict, it's up to you to either ally or attack your neighbors as you formulate a winning strategy. Unlike similar games, Call of War is unique with its cross-platform support, which allows you to play on a desktop or take your conquest on the road seamlessly on your mobile device. Check out my link in the description below to download the game today, and you'll get a special bonus of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so set the game to download and enjoy the rest of this video. The subject of today's video is a tank of many names, known as the Liberty Tank, the International Tank, or the Anglo-American Tank. The name most people today associate with it is the much less glamorous designation of Heavy Tank Mark 8. Likely, I've already started at least a few people on a tirade in the comments who are too impatient to watch past the opening before writing an essay about how this design is not just American built. Settle down, we've just started the video, at least give me a few minutes to get into the story. The Mark 8 was indeed not solely an American design, which should be fairly obvious from its shape. Although there are clear differences in the tank, the traditional British rhomboid shape is still quite evident in the design. The idea of a joint program with the Americans came almost immediately after them officially joining the conflict in April 1917. Likely biting their tongues, the British did not go running to the US right away, however, and the US Navy would be the ones to first request tanks. Initially, the design was to be based on the Mark VI currently in development for use by the Marine Corps. This tank was planned as the next tank for the British, who secretly hoped for assistance from American industry in production of these machines. Despite the design being sound, the US believed they could work to design one even better and more fitting of their industrial capacities. With that, we finally reached the birth of the Mark VIII from a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Albert Gerald Stern. At the time all this was happening, the Mark VIII was technically a completely fake tank made up by Stern. As the US wanted to work on the design themselves, this seemed to do the trick and lured in the Navy, who planned to send over their own engineers for the project. This would come to a halt when the American Department of War instead gave the Army this task. American Major H.W. Alden was then sent overseas to work with the British in London on the design on the 3rd of October 1917. The created plans called for a tank which was 10.4 meters or 34 feet 2 inches long with a 200-liter fuel tank to allow 60 to 80 kilometers of range. Several short months later, the Minister of Munitions, Winston Churchill, signed off on the design on December 4th, 1917. Now, with an approved design, an optimistic goal of 1,500 tanks by the end of 1918 was set. This would be done through international effort, with the UK, US, and France all contributing to the production. The US would provide the engines and powertrains for the tanks, with the British producing the armor plating, weaponry, and structural parts. These would then be joined in a brand new French factory. These dreams of an international tank would be short-lived, as the war was ended before full production could begin. This was caused by a number of factors, such as the fact that the factory in France was not even completed by June of 1918. This factory was eventually finished in November, but the war was over by that point and the project was shelved for France. Across the Atlantic, the Liberty engine planned for the tanks had its pistons recast, causing it to not be ready until October, along with the other US-produced components. This would not end the project, though, with one mild steel hull having arrived in the US in July of 1918. As I mentioned just a moment ago, however, many of the parts needed for its completion were not available. These parts ended up being partially engineered and produced by the Locomobile Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, under the direction of Colonel James Dudley Skinner. Putting his engineer degree to work, his team and the manufacturing company completed the tank on the 28th of September. Upon completion, the first test of the tank would also take place in Bridgeport on the 31st of October, with the tank reportedly being able to cross a 14-foot trench and knock down trees with a diameter of 2 feet. The tank would continue testing into 1919, eventually resulting in an order for 100 of the tanks for the US. These were to be constructed at Rock Island Arsenal using the 100 component sets produced by Britain. These 100 tanks began production on the 1st of July 1919, with the first tank being completed on January 5th, 1920, and the last being finished on June 5th. In total, these tanks were built at a cost of $35,000 per tank, which when you adjust for inflation comes to $559,573.12 per tank. As for the British, they would also build some Mark VIIIs of their own, with the first prototype being delivered the day of the armistice. In total, they would complete 32 of these tanks, with the only major difference from the American machines being the engine, which was changed from a Liberty engine to 2 V6 Ricardo engines from Rolls-Royce, which were arranged to form a single V12. These tanks would also retain the Hotchkiss machine guns, with the US-made ones switching to the 1917 Brownings. Speaking of the armament, let's take a break from the overall development story and look at what exactly these tanks were equipped with. The Mark VIII was to be fitted with a sponson on either side, each containing a 6-pounder cannon and a machine gun mounted on the door behind it. When preparing the tanks for transport, it was made possible to pull these sponsons inward using built-in rollers to decrease the width of the tank. Complementing the sponson-mounted weaponry was a further 8 machine guns spread around the hull for a total of 10 Hotchkiss machine guns. Only the first US prototype would actually be completed in this configuration, as the later tanks would only receive 7, later reduced to 5 when the 2 on the side doors were removed to lower the required crew. The British-built tanks would maintain the full armament. The cannons would be fed using the 208 rounds with a mixture of solid shot and canister carried within the tank. For the machine guns, a small arsenal of 15,000 rounds would be carried. Moving to the armor of this machine, it was fairly well protected for its day, with armor ranging from 16mm on the front and sides, 12mm on the rear, and 6mm on the roof and belly. This may not be as thick as its German counterpart, the K-Wagen, which boasted 30mm, but it also weighed considerably less, at around 38 tons compared to upwards of 120. With this weight, the Mark 8 was still capable of a respectable speed for its day, with the tank's handbook rating it at 5.2 miles per hour. For its true top speed, I found conflicting information, with one source putting it as high as just over 8 miles per hour, whereas most others put it at around 6. Either way, this was still around the speed of its peers, meaning it wouldn't be holding up the advance, but before you consider daily driving one of these, I should warn you, with the tank getting about a quarter mile to the gallon, the frequent trips to the gas pump would probably be more painful than the slow speed during your daily commute. Enough number crunching though, how would these tanks have been used in combat? The tactics of the tanks in combat would be explained in a document called Plan 1919. This would see the Mark 8s advance into the enemy lines in the hundreds to break a hole in the defenses. Following behind them would be medium tanks, which would push through and disrupt the enemy's rear positions. This would be supported by not just supply-carrying tanks, but potentially even aircraft to keep the tanks loaded with fuel and ammo, allowing the push to go farther into the enemy lines. This plan was proven to be decades ahead of its time when the Germans would make use of a similar strategy during the early Second World War in the form of the Blitzkrieg. Obviously, the Mark 8s would never actually be used in this strategy, but it helps justify what the design of the tanks was focused around. Frankly, the rest of the Mark 8's life was unremarkable, with them never seeing combat. In fact, the only battle damage received was caused by minor engine fires as well as a loading accident. When one tank was being loaded for transport, a part of the rail car failed, causing it to roll off and land upside down. No one was injured from this accident, including the tank, which was pulled back over by another tank. It was then driven back to the factory and the dents were easily repaired. The Mark 8s were also used for a few different tests of modifications to the tanks. This included testing an experimental engine air cooling system, the removal of the raised cupola on a British example, and the testing of a stroboscope cupola like that of the Char 2C. This device would replace the commander's original cupola with a rotating device with vertical slots in it. This would in theory provide a 360-degree view, with the slots fusing into an unbroken image if the rotations per minute were correct. According to the French, who initially tested the concept, this provided both a good view for the commander and protection from small caliber rounds. The US tests, on the other hand, found the opposite to be the case and the concept was abandoned. For a great example of this system in action, you can actually see it on the Char 2C in Battlefield 1. The only other variation of the Mark 8 of note is the proposed Mark 8 Star, which would have been a lengthened version of the standard tank. Had this tank been built, it would have been the longest tank ever produced at a total length of 13.4 meters or 44 feet, surpassing the K-Wagen by 1 foot and only increasing the weight to 47 tons. As this extra length would cause issues with turning for the tank, it was to be given more curved track lengths to decrease the amount of track that contacted the ground. In theory, this would have allowed the tank to cross trenches up to 18 feet or 5.5 meters wide. As the war had ended though, this idea was never pursued. As for the Mark 8s that were produced, the British tanks were taken by rail to the village of Wool and were then driven to Bovington. There they were essentially forgotten amongst the returning veteran tanks and were slowly scrapped, aside from one which was part of the initial group of tanks that would grow into the Tank Museum. As for the American tanks, they would see a bit more usage. The 100 which were built primarily equipped the 67th Infantry Regiment, who used them for training. However, with the emergence of tanks like the M2 Medium, the Mark 8s were finally withdrawn from service in 1932, being parked at Aberdeen. There they sat for the better part of a decade, exposed to the elements. However, according to numerous sources, including the book Firepower by R.P. Honeycutt, around the start of World War II, some of these tanks would find their way into the hands of the Canadians, who would use them for training along with US-built Renault FTs. One source claims this to be a myth though, with only the Renault FTs going to Canada. Unfortunately, that article failed to list its sources, so I was unable to determine if that was true.
Yeah.
today, June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins. This operation is the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and they are invading with the largest invasion force in the history of warfare. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Our most recent regular weekly episode came out just 2 days ago, so today I'm only going to cover some events from June 21st and the morning of June 22nd. In the early morning of the 21st, a submarine commander in the Soviet Red Navy reports the sighting of a convoy of 32 German troop transports at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland. That evening, General Maxim Perkayev phones Red Army Chief of Staff Georgy Zhukov to tell him that a German sergeant major has come to the Soviet border guards and is telling them that the German troops are all at their jumping off areas and they will attack in the morning. That deserting soldier's name, by the way, is Alfred Liskov, a dedicated communist who swims across the Bug River to warn the Soviets. Well, Perkayev calls Zhukov, and he calls Joseph Stalin, and then Stalin and Zhukov meet Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko at the Kremlin. Stalin says that the Germans may have sent this turncoat to provoke a conflict. Timoshenko nixes this and tells Joe that the Germans have also cut the telephone lines into the Soviet Union, and they really need to alert all their troops in the border districts. Stalin says it's too early for that, but does agree to a directive to the military councils in the border districts, warning them that a sudden German attack might happen, but he adds that they should not be incited by any provocations made by the Germans. That directive goes out just after midnight. What else is going on that night? A few stories from that night, courtesy of Martin Gilbert. Adolf Hitler is with Albert Speer and Erich Raeder. After dinner, he speaks of his plans for building a German naval base near Trondheim, Norway, the biggest dockyards in the Reich, and they would build a city there too for 250,000 Germans to live in. Hitler puts on the gramophone and plays his guests Franz Liszt's Le Prélude, telling them they should get used to hearing it because it's going to be the victory fanfare for Barbarossa. He also talks of his plans for building huge monumental buildings in Berlin and other German cities. Those plans, he said, are now sealed in blood because Russia will be the source of granite and marble in any quantities they should want. At Novgorod-Volensk, Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky is guest of honor at a concert at his headquarters. And when he gets the Moscow directive, he orders his commanders to go to their units after the concert. General Dmitry Pavlov in Kiev is watching a comedy, and when he gets the word, he chooses to see the show to its end. In Themiatychit, there is a ball in progress the evening of the 21st, and the attendees include, as they often do at such functions there, the German border patrol from the other side of the border, as well as many people from the local Jewish population. The ball is still in full swinging progress past 4 a.m. when bombs begin falling and the power goes out. See, despite all the buildups of men and material and all the foreshadowing and everything I've talked about for months and months, the Soviets are taken by nearly total surprise. The Germans have 140 of their own divisions, and their allies and co-belligerents will throw in more. This all includes 17 panzer divisions and 13 motorized ones. Side note here, before I go further, different sources do slightly disagree on exact numbers. We actually have a special episode about the state of the German and Soviet armies, link at the end, so you can see it more in depth. So far during the war, the losses the Wehrmacht has taken are pretty tiny by 20th century war numbers, especially compared to World War I figures. They've lost some 70,000 men killed or missing in Poland, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, Yugoslavia, Greece, North Africa, and Crete combined. The army has grown in size from 3.7 million men to 5 million, the Luftwaffe to 1.7 million, the Kriegsmarine to 400,000, and even the Waffen-SS from 50,000 to 150,000. The German army, with the air fleets which supported it, was not only larger, but disproportionately stronger in every way, in weapons, in reserves, but above all in operational skill than in 1939. Hitler's rearmament program of 1935 to 39 had merely lent military weight to his adventures in foreign policy. His war-making had permeated the whole of German society. 1 German male in 4 was now in uniform. Most had directly experienced victory, had trodden the soil of occupied territory, and had seen soldiers of the victor nations of 1918 taken into captivity. The red, white, black, and swastika flag had been raised from the Meuse to the Memel, from the Belt to the Adige, as the national anthem proclaimed it should fly, and German soldiers now stood ready to carry it even deeper into the zone of conquest Hitler had worked out as his own, into Stalin's Russia. Here is the German roll call on June 22nd from north to south. Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb is 26 divisions. These are in 2 armies, the 18th under Georg von Kuchler and the 16th under Ernst Busch. Erich Höppner's 4th Panzer Group is there in 3 panzer divisions. 1 army division is in reserve and 3 are earmarked as security forces. They are supported by Luftflotte 1. Army Group Center, the largest force, is led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. This is 51 divisions. There are 2 panzer groups, the 3rd under Hermann Hoth. Yeah, it begins this week, but it doesn't change anything. Why? Because it's not part of the Second World War. Yeah, okay, fine. Look, I'll mention it. Okay. July 11th, 1941. You've launched a gargantuan offensive on your enemy, sending millions of troops forth to crush him, and you achieve rapid success, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war. But how do you corral them, and move them, and guard them? You better figure it out pretty quick. Not today. Too much to cover. June 10th, 1944. A few years ago, they were pushed back beyond the water. But this week, they are back, and they are back in force. This week, the Soviets attack the Finns. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II, and I bet that's not what you thought I was gonna start with today. I am gonna skip the recap of last week's episode for once, and jump right into the action. While it is true that the Soviets were pushed back beyond Lake Ladoga a few years ago, and while it is true that they are indeed attacking the Finns this week, I will begin this week over in Western Europe, where a huge operation is taking place. Okay, late in the day on the 4th, the Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower decides that the cross-channel Allied invasion of Normandy can take place the 6th. This is a tough call, and he makes it only after meteorologists say there will be a break in the weather the 6th. See, they want to make the amphibious landings at dawn, and they need to make them when it's not high tide, so the engineering teams can clear the beach obstacles up to the high tide line for all the ships that are to follow, bringing all the follow-up stuff in. The right tidal conditions occur only like 3 days every 2 weeks. It would also be nice for a late moonrise to help the airborne troops who will be landing hours before the dawn. The right conditions do happen on the 5th and 6th, but not so much the 7th. And if they don't do this now, then the next proper tidal conditions will be the 20th, but the favorable moon and tide combo won't happen again till July. So on the one hand, postponement would hurt morale, would allow the Germans to beef up their defenses, would be terrible for relations with the Soviets, and would jeopardize security. Then again, if they go through with it and the weather is against them, it might be a total failure. In their favor, the bad weather has convinced Erwin Rommel, who commands the German defenses in Normandy, that an invasion won't come, and he's gone to Germany for his wife's birthday. Many junior German commanders in Normandy are also away at training exercises in Brittany. So, June 6th it is. Now, we have launched an entire channel called D-Day 24 Hours, which is just what it says it is. 24 hours of coverage of Operation Neptune, the opening act of Operation Overlord. In that, we also go into all the planning, the intelligence, the news stories, the civilians, the defenses, and much, much more. So if you really want to understand D-Day, I highly recommend you check that out. Okay, on June 6, 1944, the Allies launch Operation Neptune to land elements of 4 Army Corps on 5 beaches on the coast of Normandy. These have been given the code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The landings come just after dawn, but before that is not only a big preliminary bombardment by the air forces, there is also a huge one by the mother of all fleets from offshore. And before that, not long after midnight, airborne units arrive by glider and parachute. It is they who have specific missions that could affect the success or the failure of the day's landings. The British airborne units must take if they can and destroy if they can't the bridges over the River Orne and Caen Canal to prevent the enemy from bringing reinforcements from the east. Blowing up the bridges on the Dives River also helps with this. The American airborne units must take the causeways leading from Utah Beach across the flooded marshland. There are also artillery batteries to be taken and bridges and locks to control. Establishing a beachhead on the Cotentin Peninsula would furthermore help isolate Cherbourg. Of course, there is way more info and detail in the Special D-Day series about everything you could possibly want to know about Operation Neptune, so I won't really go into it here, just a little bit in general. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, is the headquarters of Dwight Eisenhower. He has like 3 million men under him, and the preparations for the invasion have been enormous. They've also been protected by an immense deception campaign, which we've gone over several times before, and which has been successful. Most of the Germans think their attack will come at the Pas de Calais. You might think they need to hit a port, or to take one very soon to bring in reinforcements before the enemy can knock them off of any beachhead they might make, but you would be wrong. They are well aware that trying to take a fortified and well-defended port city with frontal attacks is a sure recipe for a lot of dead bodies, so they are bringing their own harbors with them. 2 of them, Mulberry Harbors, portable, temporary harbors developed by the British War Office and Admiralty that are to be brought in if and when the amphibious landings can secure a beachhead. One to the Americans at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, and one to the British at Arromanches. These are huge, with great masses of concrete, steel, roadways. They are actual harbors, and their construction has taken up a decent-sized chunk of British war production the past few months. They are untested, though. So British Commander Bernard Montgomery has been thinking like this. He could not win the reinforcement race unless he could secure the major port of Cherbourg early in the operation. The Mulberry Harbors were untried devices which it would be unwise to depend on for any length of time. Cherbourg, however, was so heavily defended that it was unlikely to succumb quickly to Allied attack unless it could be isolated and German attention distracted from its fate by a threat to something much more important to their strategy, such as the city of Paris. Paris was too far inland to serve as an objective, but the city of Caen would do almost as well. Caen was the main center of communications in Normandy. It lay on the edge of a stretch of good tank country which led directly to Paris. Montgomery believed if he took Caen, or even threatened it, Rommel would react by concentrating his forces to prevent an Allied advance into this open country. The Caen area was, in his view, the ideal objective for the British, while simultaneously diverting German attention from Cherbourg, which was to be the Americans' primary objective. I'm sure you all remember Rommel from other theaters of the war. As for the action of the day, the British airborne troops, though coming in fairly scattered, managed to achieve all of their objectives and hold the bridges until the men arrived from the beaches. The American landings are even more scattered, which really confuses the Germans actually, but they managed to secure causeways for the men arriving later to not get stuck on Utah Beach, as well as occupying the important junction town of Saint-Mère-Église. At Utah, over 23,000 men are landed by the end of the day, with fewer than 200 being killed, which is a big success. Predictions about casualties have been very much higher, particularly with respect to the airborne units, running as high as 3/4. At Omaha Beach, it's a different story. A host of problems lead to the attackers taking heavy casualties straight off the bat and being held pretty much at the water's edge. But the incoming tide and incoming waves of men and a renewed naval bombardment slowly expand the beachhead, and by the end of the day, over 34,000 men have come ashore, though no one has advanced more than 1.5 kilometers inland. One thing that hurts the Americans here is that their engineers don't have the specialized armor that engineers on the British beaches have to clear obstacles and mines and all. Well, they don't have it other than amphibious tanks. On the British beaches, there is more initial success than at Omaha. At Gold, there is stiff resistance, but it's overcome eventually and 25,000 men are landed. They do head inland, but do not reach their objectives of Bayeux or the Bayeux-Cannes Road this day. The Canadian landings at Juno managed to push off the beaches and inland pretty quickly. Over 21,000 men land there. At Sword on the east, the British do manage to land and overcome beach resistance, but a massive traffic jam during high tide prevents them from quickly